The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
The freedom of a people to choose its leaders is the root of liberty.
Keep alive this experiment in liberty.
Liberty, in case you've forgotten, is the soul's right to breathe.
Government should be very minimal in protecting liberty.
Peace cannot be purchased at the cost of liberty.
The sturdy ground of liberty.
Liberty once lost is lost forever.
Fight for their liberty and for our security.
Guarantees individual liberty.
This great republic, born alone in liberty.
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 Just how much do you want liberty?
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner,
a production of LibertyNation.com.
Cutting through the double talk, taking on the topics, going after what the politicians really mean, and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
He was presented as a paragon of virtue, competence, and integrity. But what is Robert Mueller now? Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. We will examine the extraordinary failure of former Special Counsel Robert Mueller to defend his own report and shed any new light on his almost 2-year-long investigation in a moment. And as the Democrats prepare for round 2 of their presidential debates, we'll bring on LibertyNation.com national correspondent Joe Schaeffer to analyze the state of play in the Democrats' crowded field of candidates. And LibertyNation.com's Mark Angelides will jump on board from the UK to discuss the changing of the guard in England with the rise of the fiery new pro-Brexit Prime Minister Boris Johnson.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
We commence the proceedings with our signature segment, Say What, where we roll out a virtual assembly line of wacky, astonishing, damnable, and ultimately revealing statements uttered by politicians and the chattering class. It is hard to imagine a steeper fall from grace than that experienced by one Robert Mueller this week, the former special counsel in whom the left invested so many of their hopes to take down President Trump by any means which avail themselves, went before 2 congressional committees and was reduced from a man presented as a paragon of competence and integrity and honor to a doddering old man, stumbling over and over, seemingly uninformed about his own report. Both sides of the political divide agreed that it was an embarrassing performance for Mueller to leave as his swan song. If you listen to one of the members of the House Judiciary Committee, Ted Lieu, the day before Mueller testified, you can hear how Democrats were anticipating that Americans watching on TV would witness a powerful and damning indictment from Mueller.
Their minds may be blown because they're going to see facts that they never saw. They're going to be seeing that the president directed his White House counsel to fire the special counsel. That's a crime. They're going to see that the president directed his White House counsel to then cover that up and create a fake document. That's a second crime. And then they're going to see that he directed Corey Lewandowski to ask Jeff Sessions to limit their investigation into Donald Trump. That's a third crime.
But when the day came for Mueller to appear before the House Judiciary Committee on Wednesday morning and the Intelligence Committee in the afternoon, this is what we got.
Don't use the word collusion. The word we usually use is not collusion. Can you read or can you repeat the question? Could you repeat the question for me again? I'm sorry. What was the question? You read the last question. Can you repeat the question? Can you repeat the last part of that question? That went a little fast for me. You have to repeat that for me. Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry. Could you repeat that one? I apologize.
Sure.
Can you start it again? I'm sorry. Could you again repeat the question? Pardon me? Sorry. Can you move the microphone up a little closer?
Director, please speak into the microphone.
I'm sorry. Thank you.
Director, could you speak more directly into the microphone?
I'd have to look more closely at the statute.
Well, I just read it to you.
I have no knowledge on either. Don't know that for sure. I am not familiar with that. I'm not going to comment on that. I'm not going to try to explain that. I'm not going to speak to that. Can't get into that. That's not within my purview. It's outside our purview.
It was actually sad to watch this faded Washington antiquity, Mueller. Almost. Until you realize how many lives were ruined by Mueller's investigation, which turned up nothing other than crimes committed long before the Trump campaign got started in the case of Paul Manafort, or alleged false statements during the Mueller investigation in the case of George Papadopoulos, Michael Flynn, and Roger Stone. And Mueller refused to answer any questions about the origins of his investigation, namely the story about Russians hacking Hillary Clinton's emails that was planted with the unwitting George Papadopoulos first by the mysterious Joseph Mifsud, who lied to investigators, but unlike the Trump allies, was not indicted for making false statements. Mueller evaded all the questions about that put to him by Congressman Jim Jordan.
When the special counsel's office interviewed Mifsud, did he lie to you guys too?
Can't get into that.
Did you interview Mifsud?
Can't get into that.
Is Mifsud Western intelligence or Russian intelligence?
Can't get into that.
A lot of things you can't get into.
Can't get into that. A lot of things you can't get into. Like the things Attorney General William Barr is now investigating, whether spying on the Trump campaign conducted by and admitted to by the Obama Justice Department was warranted. Jim Jordan carried on.
Maybe a better course of action is to figure out how the false accusation started. Maybe it's to go back and actually figure out why Joseph Mifsud was lying to the FBI. And here's the good news. Here's the good news. That's exactly what Bill Barr's doing. And thank goodness for that. That's exactly what the Attorney General and John Durham are doing. They're going to find out why we went through this three-year saga and get to the bottom of it.
George Papadopoulos, the man set up at ground zero by Joseph Mifsud, will join us in just a bit to tell you the whole story of how this whole Trump-Russia collusion thing began. So, how bad was Robert Mueller? Well, so bad that even the anti-Trump leftists in the media panned his performance, like Jeremy Bash on MSNBC.
Far from breathing life into the report, he kind of sucked the life out of the report. I thought he was boring. I thought in some cases he was sort of evasive. He didn't want to explain or expand on his rationale. He seemed lost at times. He was kind of flipping through the report, trying to find passages that members of Congress were reading to him. And I thought it really was a very ineffective defense of his own work.
And over on CNN, Trump basher Phil Mudd said the Democrats, and him for sure, were let down big time.
2 words. They should shut up. They might see some indication of wrongdoing. A, as you're suggesting, they will never reach the end of this in 15 months. And B, it's going to divide America. So if you can't reach a conclusion, and if it's bad for the country, regardless of whether you see some evidence of wrongdoing, do you think that you should pursue this? If you think Americans are going to say, I'm going to watch this show, paint drying, for another 15 months, leave me alone. Find something else like health care to worry about.
Indeed, Mueller showed that he was likely barely involved in the operations of his own investigation, and it gave credence to the widespread reports that it was his deputy, the virulently anti-Trump investigator Andrew Weissman, who was really running the show, with Mueller serving as a mere figurehead. Chuck Rosenberg, legal analyst for MSNBC, put this week's Mueller movie in a final perspective.
Occasionally the books are better than the movies. In this case, the book was much better than the movie. But nothing of substance changed.
So chalk up another swamp creature unmasked by President Trump, Robert Mueller, exposed for his central role in trying like hell to kneecap the 45th president, but like all the others, failing to close the deal. Meanwhile, the president continued to go after the squad in his ongoing efforts to depict the Democrats as extreme leftists, this time going after AOC cohort Rashida Tlaib, who it turns out was actually caught on camera at a Trump rally in 2016, screaming and carrying on, and had to be dragged out by security.
I watched her this morning. She's vicious.
She's like a crazed lunatic. She's screaming. This is before she got into Congress. Who elected her? She's screaming like a total lunatic at one of our rallies. This is not a sane person, folks. She called our country and our people garbage. That's worse than deplorable. Remember deplorable? Oh, yes, you do. Huh? Remember Hillary, the deplorables. She actually said a word that was worse. She said deplorables, and what was the second word? Go ahead. Irredeemables.
As Trump fends off the slings and arrows of the left that he's driven to the point of insanity, so must the new Prime Minister of England, Boris Johnson, fend off the pro-EU crowd. Johnson's a fiercely pro-Brexit Tory who succeeds the failed Theresa May and promises to close the deal on Brexit.
It has become clear that there are pessimists at home and abroad who think, after 3 years of indecision, that this country has become a prisoner to the old arguments of 2016. And in this home of democracy, we are incapable of honouring a democratic mandate. And so I am standing before you today to tell you, the British people, that those critics are wrong. The doubters, the doomsters, the gloomsters, they are going to get it wrong again. The people who bet against Britain are going to lose their shirts because we're going to restore trust in our democracy.
We'll talk about the Boris Johnson era in England when we're joined by LibertyNation.com managing editor Mark Angelides a bit later on. Of course, we've got our exclusive interview with George Papadopoulos coming up, but first, the Democrats prepare for their second round of debates this coming Tuesday and Wednesday, and we'll discuss the state of play in their presidential race.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Where can you find honest political commentary with sobering analysis, accountability, deconstructing threats to our liberty, and boldly reporting the truth? Subscribe to the LibertyNation.com YouTube channel, where facts matter.
We believe that all men are entitled to blessings of liberty.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
20, count them, 20 Democratic presidential candidates are preparing for their second round of debates coming up this Tuesday and Wednesday evenings in Detroit. In Michigan, a state they dearly need to recapture if they hope to unseat President Trump. And joining us to tell us, as he does so eloquently, what to expect in this week's 20-candidate spectacle is LibertyNation.com national correspondent Joe Schaeffer. Hello, Joe.
Hello, Tim. Thanks for having me.
Well, I appreciate it as always. And you know, Joe, I sit here and shake my head in disbelief at how far the Democrats are willing to go to express their hate-filled rage against the machine that is President Trump and his followers. I'm amazed at how they're setting themselves on fire with outlandish, outright socialist ideas like the Green New Deal and government-run health care and open borders. And on top of that, marginalizing and condemning the Trump voters who put him in the White House 3 years ago. Now, you wrote something interesting to me in a message recently about how the Democrats are not only no longer a national party, but they appear to not to want to be a national party, preferring to be faithful to their socialist ideas than to winning the presidency. Expound on that, if you would.
Well, I wrote an article a couple days ago on our website. It's called "Are Dems Digging Themselves a Hole for 2020?" which pretty much says what they're doing. And I quote in that article, there's a Democratic operative in California named David Atkins, and he tweeted out the usual obnoxious thing about rural white Americans. And the guy actually said in his argument, Democrats should forget these people, meaning Trump
Right.
voters. You can't read them. Don't even waste your time tailoring messages to them. 62 million plus Americans, and this guy is telling the Democratic Party, don't even bother with them.
Yeah, Chris Hayes on MSNBC said this week that these people are beyond redemption and that what they must do is to be basically eliminated through love and peace and all that, right? So, yeah, the Democrats are out on a limb. Now, do you think, Joe, that they learned anything from their first round of debates last month? And what can we expect from this second round of Democratic debates that we didn't see in the first round in June?
Well, I think one thing we've learned is that Democrats don't learn anything. If you go back to 2016 when they said, okay, we learned what we did wrong in that election, and now here we are in 2019, and they're repeating all the same mistakes, they don't seem to learn anything. So what is going to be different in this second debate? I don't think much in terms of reaching out to those Trump voters, as we said. I expect a lot more of the lemmings, the candidates who are running out of time to make an impact, to really be impressed by what Kamala Harris did to Biden. They're all going to want to have that moment.
Right.
So I think you're going to see a lot of that, a lot of machismo, a lot of going after Biden and maybe Bernie Sanders.
Well, wait a second. Joe, machismo is no longer hip in the Democratic Party. You got to be, alpha males are not in. That's the Republican side. That's Trump. You can't be macho.
Power womanizing, yes. It's going to be like that. It's going to be like a bad sitcom. And like you said, they need to send a message of, important issues to the American people, jobs and working. And I've been noticing Elizabeth Warren has actually been trying to tack that way, talking more about the economy and issues. And then she just goes ahead and blows it by bringing up something stupid like her preferred gender pronouns. She put that on her Twitter account. It's like, we were just starting to maybe take you seriously, and then you do that.
What about Cory Booker actually walking unauthorized immigrants across the border from Mexico to the United States? A presidential candidate doing that.
I mean, he should be arrested for that, to me. I mean, that's a treasonous act. That is a criminal act. But in terms of this presidential run, it's just a desperate act of a man who hasn't caught on in any way. I expect him to be one of the ones, trying to maybe boost himself by taking on one of the bigger dogs in this upcoming debate.
I predicted that Trump will win 350 or more electoral votes, barring a depression or a bad recession or a war, which, of course, could change the entire equation. Joe, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Joe Schaeffer, national correspondent for LibertyNation.com. We'll break away for a moment, then return to talk to the man who was ground zero in the Trump-Russia collusion fantasy, George Papadopoulos.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Exhausted by all the fake news? On LibertyNation.com's YouTube channel, facts and fresh, bold analysis are what you get without the leftist spin. Subscribe today to the LibertyNation.com YouTube channel because
Truth
is making a comeback.
Far more important than my political future and far more important than yours, the well-being of our country.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
As important as what Robert Mueller said this week, or tried to say while stumbling and bumbling his way through congressional testimony, was what he didn't say or refused to say. And that was anything to do with the origins of the original Trump investigation, how the mysterious Joseph Mifsud got the ball rolling on the Trump-Russia fantasy by planting a story about Russians stealing Hillary Clinton emails with George Papadopoulos, starting a chain reaction up the line, which ultimately resulted in the Obama Justice Department spying on the Trump campaign, and then, of course, the Mueller investigation. Mr. Papadopoulos joined us recently for an exclusive interview. We played it for you first back in June, and he spoke about how it all got started with the so-called Professor Joseph Mifsud.
He is at the epicenter of probably the greatest and most pernicious spying scandal in American history, because clearly I was the one who was witnessing these events, and it was clearly a setup. And Joseph Mifsud was introduced to me by a director at a company I used to work for in London called the London Center for International Law Practice. This was a company that was affiliated by some of the most prominent attorneys in the world and Western diplomats, et cetera, and I was working as a director there in their energy department. And I told them I'm leaving and I'm going back to Washington. I'm going to be joining the Trump campaign. And they were furious. As soon as I said that to them, their antennas started to spike. I didn't understand that this organization in London I worked for obviously had some connections to the FBI too. And a woman named Arvinder Sambe, who actually worked directly with Bob Mueller after 9/11, she told me, why don't you go to Rome and meet some important people who are going to help you on the Trump campaign? And I go to Rome, or at this university called Link Campus, which is currently under investigation by Italian authorities. And I meet Joseph Mifsud there. And Joseph Mifsud, though I didn't know who this person was, and my life was I was doing a lot of traveling at the time and meeting many people, and of course I had no idea who he was, except that he told me that the company that you work for wants me to help introduce you to global leaders and the Russians. And that's how he introduced himself to me, as some sort of diplomat from Malta who was connected to the world, and that he would be helping the Trump campaign. And later we find out that he was likely working with the CIA or the British intelligence services, according to Devin Nunes.
Now, another member of the Trump foreign policy team was Carter Page, the man the FBI wound up getting a FISA warrant to surveil, and then 3 renewals of that warrant. And Carter Page warns you not to be too confident about your plan to facilitate a meeting between Trump and Vladimir Putin, which Joseph Mifsud had promised to make happen. In the book, you openly wonder whether Carter Page might actually have been a Russian agent. How come?
I was very confused about Carter Page, actually. I didn't understand what he was doing, if he was potentially cooperating whatsoever with the Russians, or we later found out that he actually had a long history with the FBI, which actually, looking back in that chapter in my book where I had that bizarre phone call with Carter Page, where he was basically threatening me and telling me he's keeping tabs on me to some extent, it was a little, he left a bad taste in my mouth, and I never quite understood why he stepped out of his lane the way he did before he even met me in person, but he did. And his background suggests that he did have contacts with the CIA, with the FBI, and I don't know. I'm not going to, spread false allegations about anyone without evidence, but clearly I think his role in all of this never really made sense to me, at least.
Okay, now you meet with Joseph Mifsud on April 26th of 2016, and he tells you the Russians have dirt on Hillary Clinton, thousands of emails. What do you do with that information?
Sure. So, as you stated at the beginning of our conversation, I was working in D.C. in foreign policy and in the energy circles, and you hear a lot of gossip when you're in these type of circles. Just like you probably do in many industries, especially if you're in an office setting. whether it's somebody's age, or their livelihood, or in this case, it happened to be the topic at the time was Hillary's hacked emails, which was obviously being openly speculated throughout the world that her State Department server had been hacked by the Russians. So about a month into meeting Joseph Mifsud, who was saying that he could introduce Trump to Putin. And look, as a foreign policy advisor, part of my duties were to introduce Donald Trump to foreign leaders. I knew Donald Trump wanted to work to some extent with Russia at the geopolitical level. That's why I thought a meeting with Putin during the campaign would be a good idea. That didn't work out, of course, because the campaign didn't want it. So then I ended up introducing Donald Trump to the Egyptian president in September of 2016 at the UN General Assembly. So that was part of my duty. So people who are listening can understand that there was nothing illegal or nefarious or illicit going on about a campaign attempting to set up a foreign policy trip for the candidate that they were working for. Barack Obama went abroad. Mitt Romney went abroad. Candidates usually do this to highlight that they can work with global leaders and obviously to impress the electorate back home. So that was really the logic behind that attempt.
Well, shortly after your meeting with Mifsud, where he said that the Russians had dirt on Hillary Clinton, about 2 weeks later, on May 10th, 2016, you have a fateful meeting in London which changes your life with another man whose name is sure to be in the news in the days ahead, an Australian named Alexander Downer, who is very confrontational with you. Take it from there, if you would.
Sure. So after Joseph Mifsud told me that the Russians have thousands of Hillary Clinton emails, I never told anyone on the Donald Trump campaign. I never told Donald Trump or Steve Bannon or anyone, even though I was in daily communication at that time with Stephen Mueller, Corey Lewandowski, and others when I was living in London. So I never told anyone. First of all, I wasn't there to discuss hacked emails. It's not my business. And I'm not involved in any illegal behavior, and neither is the campaign. So clearly, when I met Joseph Mifsud and he told me this information, I had no idea that that's why he was wanting to meet with me. So then, as you stated, I met an Australian diplomat very suspiciously 10 days after Joseph Mifsud told me this information. And Alexander Downer, for the listeners of the program, is one of Hillary Clinton's and Bill Clinton's best friends in the world. When he was Australia's foreign minister, he donated $25 million of hard-earned Australian taxpayer money to the Clinton Foundation. Clearly, during my encounter with him, he was very hostile to Donald Trump and his policies and expressed the views of the Australian government that they clearly preferred Hillary Clinton and viewed Donald Trump as a pariah. So this individual, who I reported eventually to the FBI, to Congress, because I thought he was recording my conversation with his phone, ended up somehow giving some information to somebody that was passed along to the corrupt FBI under Jim Comey to help launch an investigation, which apparently was part of why they launched this investigation. I don't buy that story. I don't think William Barr buys that story. During his interview on CBS recently, he openly debunked that the investigation was launched in July, and it was launched much earlier than that. And it's in my firm belief, and I've been very open about this, and the president has been supporting my contention that the Australians were clearly in on this operation against us from the beginning.
Now, the story that's been told and retold in the media was that when you met with Alexander Downer, the Australian, the pro-Hillary Clinton Australian diplomat, that you were plied with liquor, you were drunk, and that you spoke, you told tales out of school, but you deny that you had too much to drink at that infamous meeting and that you ever told Mr. Downer that the Russians had damaging material related to Hillary Clinton, right?
You're absolutely right. And, Downer himself has gone public, and I even wrote it in my book. We had one light gin and tonic, and I was so disturbed by Alexander Downer's behavior that, as I explained, that I actually reported him to both Congress and the FBI for spying on me because he was holding his phone in a manner that I thought was recording my conversation, and I didn't understand, quite frankly, what he was doing until later on, of course. Bob Mueller's own prosecutors told me that he was basically recording my conversation. He was obviously part of an operation. And this information has never been told before. I've just recently come out with my story, and I testified about this behind closed doors to Congress, and that testimony has just now come out. But when the president talks openly about the need for William Barr to investigate the UK and Australia, he's not simply, these are not off-the-cuff remarks. There's a reason he's suggesting it. And there's also a reason why William Barr wants to actually look into the origins of this investigation and to understand why these foreign governments were spying on us themselves. What Donald Trump has declassified, that's what members of Congress now are openly discussing regarding transcripts of my meetings with informants. And we're going to get to the bottom of who actually was handling this guy and why he was trying to entrap Flynn and me.
That is George Papadopoulos telling the ugly truth about how this whole Trump-Russia fantasy first began. And rest assured, we'll be hearing a lot more about it from Attorney General William Barr in the months ahead. Quick break, and then we're back with a man who may just be Britain's own Donald Trump.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Far more important than my political future and far more important than yours, the well-being of our country.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Well, the Brexit-hating, EU-loving, anti-nationalist, pro-globalist, internationalist elite is ablaze with fear now that the Tories have settled on a new Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, a fiery supporter of Brexit, former Mayor of London, Eton and Oxford man. He has officially ascended to the position vacated by Theresa May. And joining us from jolly old England to analyze this new day for the UK is LibertyNation.com international correspondent and managing editor Mark Angelides. Hello, Mark.
Hello, Tim. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. So, Mark, Boris Johnson appears to be the closest thing Britain has to Donald Trump. I mean, he even looks like Trump with that hair, for heaven's sake.
There is something about mad hair that befits all these world leaders. Whether it's fair to say he's the same as Donald Trump, there are some similarities in terms of both men are pushing forward quite a populist agenda. Both men have been known to get into trouble for things they say. This seems quite a common theme. But as to whether they are of the same sort of caliber and personality, perhaps not so much. Boris Johnson is very much a liberal, not as in the terms of for liberty, but a liberal as in quite, let's say, almost left-leaning in some sensibilities, which perhaps Donald Trump was as well before he became president.
But populist, no doubt, a populist like Donald Trump, yes?
No doubt whatsoever. His key platform here, which won him the leadership quite handily, I might add, with more than double the votes of the runner-up. What is a populist platform? It's Brexit, come hell or high water.
Unlike the current encrusted establishment, but Mark, the elite international media has made Boris Johnson out to be something of a buffoon, belying his academic credentials as an Eton and Oxford man, the most prestigious post-secondary school and college in England, along with Cambridge. Are they trying to do what the American media did to Trump, undermine his prime ministry before it actually kicks into gear?
Well, naturally, Tim, it's par for the course, as we say. The point is Donald Trump. See, I'm making that.
There you go. You're getting the hair mops confused.
Yeah. So Boris Johnson, his main policy platform, and what is bringing him the level of support that he's currently getting, not just from Conservative Party members, but from members of other parties as well, is Brexit. And if he's going to deliver Brexit by October 31st, this will be a shock to all those who have been campaigning for the 3 years after the referendum to try and stop Brexit. So for them, the attack on Boris, or Bojo, as we call him.
Oh, right.
These attacks are really just a continuation of Project Fear and the anti-Brexit campaign. They're just in a new guise.
So Boris is committed to getting Britain out of the EU by hook or by crook by October 31st. Now, is there any path forward now other than a hard exit? In other words, pulling out without the safety net of an acceptable agreement with the EU on separation in place?
Well, that's an interesting question. You see, the different schools of thought think that it would be obviously dangerous to stay within the EU, what with the present troubles they're having. But from the EU point of view, there is only one acceptable route to, as they call it, a divorce, which it gives you some idea of the positions in the relationship.
And not an amicable one.
Not really, but there's only one route, and that is the withdrawal agreement that was apparently brokered with Theresa May, the former Prime Minister, which was quite clearly written by Brussels, by the EU, and then handed as a fait accompli to Theresa May. But the problem with this withdrawal agreement, as it's known, is that it's been rejected by Parliament 3 times already. The UK is one of the biggest customers they have. It really is, and not by a small margin either. So all of the German car manufacturers, the French wine and cheese manufacturers, are going to suffer greatly if there isn't a deal in place, and suffer probably more than the UK will from any tariffs that arise. So I suspect that there'll be an 11th hour capitulation by the EU.
That would be at least some finalization and some clarity on something that was voted on more than 3 years ago by the Brits, of course. Now, what about Nigel Farage? What role can he and the new Brexit party play in helping push Brexit across the finish line?
Good question. Well, here's the thing. Boris Johnson, or at least members of Boris Johnson's inner circle, have already ruled out any type of coalition or pact with Nigel Farage's Brexit party. Despite, obviously, President Trump suggesting that this would be a good guy to organize your stuff. He seems to have the full support of President Trump, but not perhaps of Boris Johnson. But there is very much a role for Nigel Farage and his new party to play, and that is as a threat, a sort of Damocles, if you will, hanging over the head of Boris Johnson's premiership. Because if Boris Johnson doesn't deliver Brexit either on or before the 31st of October, he'll have to essentially call a general election. There'll be no question about that. He'll have no choice. And the Conservative Party, Boris Johnson's party, will be out of power. So Nigel Farage's role in this is as a threat.
All right. We will watch with bated breath as Britain decides on whether, well, the politicians decide on whether they're going to do what the people actually voted for them to do 3 years ago. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Tim.
Mark Angelides, managing editor for LibertyNation.com. This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcasts, The Uprising, hosted by Scott Cosenza, and The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, where past is prologue, with our own Mark Angelides. All available to you on demand at LibertyNation.com. Anytime, anywhere, any place, and also, of course, from fine podcast providers everywhere. So that is it for this week, but we'll be back at you next week, same time, same station. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying, stand up for liberty. And we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.